Yo, yo, yo. What's going on? What's going on, everyone out there? I'm your host, Dr. Sheldon L. Eakins, host of the Leading Equity Podcast. I'm also the founder of the Leading Equity Center. What else do? I do a lot of stuff these days. And so I just want to welcome everybody to the live stream, The Art of Advocacy. We're coming every single week, every Thursday, bringing the fire. We're bringing some very special guests. Make sure that you are, what did I say on those YouTube? Smash that like button and all that great stuff. Make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Follow us also on Facebook as well / Leading Equity Center. You can find all that information either on my website, Leading Equity Center, or what have you. But it's good to be back. I had a great week. I'm actually home this week, but next week I'll be headed out to San Diego. So anybody that's in the area, feel free to link up and we can try to see if we can chat. I love meeting people in person, but I'll be attending the Deeper Learning Conference next week in San Diego. I'll be speaking, doing a Den talk out there. So I'm really excited about that. I love San Diego. One of these days, I'm going to end up moving in California. I got to figure out how to maintain the cost of living. But once I get all that stuff figured out, I will be there. You know how we do. If you've been here before, I'd love to know who's out there. So feel free to say hello. Tell us where you're from. And make sure that you stay on today and get your questions together because we have a really good episode today. Live stream today. I'm so used to talking about podcast stuff, but we have a really good live stream happening today. A good friend of mine, Beth Poss, is here, and so can't wait to bring her on. But yeah, shout out where you're from. If you're a teacher, what your position is, let us know. I see Popsy is here from the East Coast. Oh, I see Candace is here. Thank you. I'm glad to see you as well. Hello, and AKA. So Ski Fi as well. Let me shout that out. But yeah, if you are out there, let us know, and we'll get started in just a moment. Now, we're going to be talking about universal design for learning and inclusive practices. And so, as a former special ed teacher, UDL is definitely something that I hold very deeply, and I think it's very important. And when we think about what it looks like for the various needs of our students, we'll talk about some equity and also supporting our students of color, what culture responsive practices can look like. So shout out to Elizabeth, who's here representing Miami, Florida. I see Rebecca's here from LA. Yo, we got a diverse group of folks that are here. So let's get going. I'm ready. So matter of fact, let me do this. I'm going to bring on Beth in just a moment, but I do want to read her bio real quick. Okay, so Beth Poss. Oh my gosh, I always mess that up. Beth Poss is a speech language pathologist, assistive technology consultant, and former assistant principal. She is currently the director of educational programs for LessonPix. Now, I also want to make sure that I add in that Beth is one of the authors of Inclusive Learning 365 Ed Tech Strategies for Every Day of the Year. That is currently out. I almost said due out. It's currently out. So here's a book right here. I'm so thankful for Beth for sending this out to me. Inclusive Learning 365 Ed Tech Strategies for Every Day of the Year. Now, this is a wonderful book. So if you do not have this, please jump on Amazon or wherever your bookstores are. Make sure you get a copy. It is definitely worth the money and it's going to enlighten you. So without further ado, let me shout out Defina's here from NYC, Dean of DEI. There's a Dean of DEI position. I like that title. Aaron is here. I'm glad you're here. And I got Sandy here from NC. We got a lot of folks. So I'm going to bring on Beth. So let's see if we can get that set up. Beth, thank you so much for joining us today.
I am so glad to be here. And I'm having one of those moments where I'm seeing some names of people in the chat who I follow on social media, and I'm like, oh wow! So like I know I follow Popsy on social media, and I always the amazing things that she's posting. So I'm like, oh my gosh, she's in the audience. I'm having a little bit of a fangirl moment here. You know, it's all of that. So it's really cool when worlds collide a little bit and disparate groups come together. So yeah.
Thank you. And let me say thank you so much. I believe I was on the wrong mic, so I believe I'm on the right microphone. So hopefully I sound a little bit better. I appreciate Teachers on Fire for reaching out, let me know. I appreciate the heads up. So we should be sounding a lot better. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. And look at Popsy. She's thanking you as well. Let me pop that up on as well. Popsy's a good friend of mine, so I always appreciate seeing her as well. Now, I read a bit of your bio, but that's what's out there. That's what's on paper. But I'd love for folks to know a little bit more about Beth. So why don't you share a little bit more about yourself that I haven't already shared on your bio?
Oh, wow. I mean, we could everything from, right now, the most important thing I got going on in my world is that I have a daughter getting married in less than 3 weeks. And so that's sort of like all consuming at the moment, and where my head has been at. But no, I am so fortunate because I get the opportunity to work with and talk with educators from all over the country and all over the world, and talk to them about um, inclusive educational practices and resources to support all of our learners, and resources to empower learners. And so, yeah, so this last few months since our book came out, gosh, it's been since like August. I think the book came out in August. Has been really exciting to be talking about inclusive education, right? This has been my not the book itself, but this idea, inclusive learning, has been my mantra for a long time. And having an opportunity to share that with other people has been really, really exciting. And it's so critical right now, I think, more than ever, this idea of inclusive education and inclusive educational practices.
Okay. First of all, congrats on your daughter and family. Family is a big deal, so I'm glad to hear that, and I'm also glad that you hear that you are traveling and getting this work done. And you mentioned inclusive education, and I want to start there because I think that's important. That's going to set the tone for this conversation. So why don't you share with us, what does inclusive practice look like?
Yeah, I mean, so it's the idea that we need to really be reaching all learners. And when we, there's a saying out there, twatty, right? That's the way we've always done it. When we keep doing things the way we've always done it, we know that we're not reaching all learners. I mean, we know it because the data shows it. We know it because we can see it in our classrooms every day. And I think when the pandemic hit us all and we all had to convert over um, to online teaching and change the way we do things, we all as educators had to all of a sudden get really flexible with the way we do things. And it was sort of a breakthrough moment, I think, for a lot of people. And one of my biggest concerns that I've had since we've gotten back in the classroom over the last year or so, is to not go back to the way that we've always done things. And the idea of inclusive practices are practices that are flexible, and that allow us to teach to the margins, right? There's a misnomer, I think, in education that there's an average student, right? Like there's no such thing as average. There's a great video out there. It's actually a book by Todd Rose called "The Myth of Average." There's no such thing as an average learner or an average learning profile, right? And if what we've been doing is teaching to the average, we are missing so much. And not only is there not an average learner, but the idea that every student, every learner has learner variability within them, right? So what might work on one day in one setting in one subject might not work for that same learner on a different day in a different setting, and a different topic. So when we talk about inclusive learning practices, it's really about developing an inclusive mindset. And one of the things that has been really kind of, I don't want to, life-changing, right? Like life-changing in the world of education, but life-changing actually in a lot of different ways, has been thinking about the language that we use as educators, right? So I personally, we actually as authors sat down, when we sat down to write this book, and we started writing, and we were like, started talking about the language that we were using. And should we say students? Should we say teachers? Should we say educators? Like, I don't have a degree in, I actually do have a degree in educator, but I'm not an educator, right? I was a speech language pathologist when I was in the classroom as an educator, right? I never taught in a third grade classroom or a first grade classroom or anything like that. But I see myself as an educator, right? One of my other co-authors is an occupational therapist who has worked in schools for years and years, but she's not a teacher, right? So thinking about that language. And so we made a really conscious decision, and I've made a really conscious decision in the way that I talk about education, that we are talking about learners, because I think that's a much broader way of referencing those individuals than students. Learners, just as, the idea of being a lifelong learner, like you might not be a lifelong student, but you hope you're going to be a lifelong learner. The idea of educators, that every single person who is working in education is an educator. I was an assistant principal, right? And I used to go and talk to my building service workers and my cafeteria staff. And we would talk about, like, I'd say to them, like, what's your job? And, the cafeteria manager would say, well, I need to make sure the food is out. And I'd be like, yeah, that's a part of your job, but that's not actually your job. And my building service person would say, well, I need to make sure the classrooms are clean. And I'd be like, yeah, that's a part of your job, but that's not really your job. Because you know what really your job is to make sure that every learner, every student that walks in this building is getting the education that is going to support them to move along in their lives and get to that next step for themselves, right? So you're all educators, right? Your job title might be building service worker, or it might be classroom teacher, or it might be speech language pathologist, but we are all educators that are supporting those learners, right? And that idea that the work that we do needs to be very learner centered, and as opposed to adult centered. So I think it's that language that we use is a big part of developing that inclusive mindset. One of the other things, I think, one of the other language pieces that I've sort of switched to is we used to do a lot of talk, or I used to do a lot of talk personally about engaging learners, right? Which is important, right? Like learner engagement is really important. I'm not minimizing that at all. But what we really need to do is we need to empower learners. We need to make sure that learners are going to be engaged. We know learners are going to be engaged when they feel empowered over their own learning. And that's sort of, we talked about the idea of universal design for learning, and that's sort of where some of that kind of wraps in. So for folks that may or may not be familiar with the concept of universal design for learning, it's a framework for looking at education, and it's built on brain-based research. It's one of those things I had to stop for a second because I'm gonna too many B's there and R's. Built on brain-based research, and the goal of it is it's looking at three things, right? It's looking at the why of learning. So why are students learning? Why are learners learning, right? It's looking at the what of learning. So what is it actually that they're taking in? And when we look at the why of learning, that's really that engagement piece. Like, how do we get them to pay attention to it? How are we gaining and sustaining their interest? How are we providing ways for them to sustain effort and persistence with that? And then it's the what of learning. So like, what exactly is the information that we are feeding to them? Like, what kind of what options are we giving them to Do they have to read a book, or can they watch a video, or can they listen to a podcast? Can they do research? Can they engage in conversations? Can they write a 3-paragraph essay? What all of those kinds of things. And then it's like the how of learning. How are we letting them express what they are learning, right? Does everything have to be assessed via a test? Or that 3-paragraph essay that actually comes under the how of learning. Are those the only ways that we are going to show that kids get to show what they know? So it really goes around those ideas of how are we creating options and flexibility for learners. So that's sort of like universal design for learning, very, very much in a nutshell. And it's really about the design of learning, right? It's pre-planning to overcome potential barriers that our learners are going to face. It's giving them choice, which helps learners become empowered, and so that they can learn how to learn. And it's building expert learners who are empowered to drive their own education. And I'm seeing the comment that you put up from Davina, and that I completely agree that there's a difference between empowering versus engaging students. Bringing in the concept of empowerment and reviewing the quality of schools. What would the tools of measurement for school leaders and district leaders to assess whether students are empowered? That is like that's a great question. How do we measure it through formal and informal? So I'm going to say yes. We do measure it through formal and informal.
Yeah.
And informal assessments.
But I think that's a great question and thank you, Davina, for your question, because I think it is important to say, well, is empowerment measurable, or is engagement measurable? And as a researcher myself, it's just like, okay, well, how do we know? I think you can measure it by getting that feedback from students or parents and community members as well. But that is a conversation that you have to be willing to have, and I think sometimes it gets overlooked. So when we circle back to the idea of inclusivity, and what that looks like, because I think there's multiple perspectives of what inclusive looks like, because as a SPED person, it's like, okay, are we making sure that our students with IEPs are included within the classroom, in the general population classrooms? And then others might say, what inclusivity means, are we making sure that students that are not part of the dominant culture, and whatever that looks like, whatever their identity is, are they included, or do they feel welcomed or feel a sense of belonging in the school culture? Now, it seems like, Beth, you primarily touched on from a assessment or academic side, but I wonder if you have some thoughts on what inclusive could look like for students who are not part, outside of the academic realm.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's feeling that students belong, right? I think there's actually some really good information out there on the idea of cognitive engagement, that if learners don't feel that what they're learning is relevant to them and to their personal lives, they're not going to be cognitively engaged. You can't take the two away from each other. They're so intertwined, right? You are not going to have academic success, or at least the same kind of academic success, when students' social emotional learning needs aren't being met, when they feel disengaged from what's happening. And when you said before, like, when you mean inclusion, do you mean like students with disabilities included, or do you mean like disenfranchised populations or marginalized populations? My answer is yes. Like, it's both. Yes. It's all of that, right? Like that. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not one and it's not the other. And when we ignore one or the other, like if we're in the world of talking about equity, but we ignore students with disabilities, then we're engaging in ableism, right? Right? Yeah. We could be planning for all this stuff. And if we're on the side of supporting learners with disabilities, but we're not taking into account the culture and language of those students, the backgrounds of those students, if we're not looking at the fact that that we are still seeing over identification of Black and Brown children, of English language learners, multilingual learners in special education, then we're not looking at that, right? So it can't be an either or. It's got to be both.
Well, here's the thing. And you're exactly right. It can't be either or. We have kids of color who have IEPs, right? Who are, so there's an intersectional piece as well. It's
Right.
not just, oh, just these kids have disabilities and then these kids, you're like, no, you have kids that have all of that, right? They come in with multiple identities and abilities. And I think that when we try to just say, well, inclusiveness means blah, 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 but it's really one-sided. It's not really encompassing what a student's identity might mean. You could have a Black child who has an IEP or who has a 504, and they need to feel included within their classroom as far as the academic side, and then also from the social part. I love that you brought up the social and emotional piece. I hate that it's under fire these days with, being under this whole umbrella of equity, and I don't really understand why people have an issue with social and emotional learning.
Oh man, I was invited to put in a proposal for a session for a conference at a state level in a state. And I knew from what I'd heard on the news that if I took the session that I was going to do was all about social emotional learning. But if I put it in with that in the title, like they were going to be like, what? We don't talk about that here. And I was just like, all right, how am I going to like work this? So it was, I did something around empowerment and how to, develop classroom positive classroom environments. Like I was trying to like dance, and again, it's that language piece, right? Like I was trying to dance around, how do I not have the title social emotional learning? How do I not have the words in the title of social emotional learning? Because it's like all of a sudden it's become in certain areas, it's become like that's not the terms that we want to use. There's so much with language that's going on, right? I mean, even the other kind of piece that we had talked about that part of this was going to be about was around culturally responsive teaching. And I've even started saying culturally responsive instruction or culturally sustaining teaching, just because there's too many like people hear culturally responsive teaching and, oh, that's CRT. And I'm like, okay, no, not really. So again, it all comes down to this language. And I think if we can just really, if I just saw the comment from Elizabeth, if there is an SEL, students won't be empowered. This needs to be interconnected. It's the truth. And to be perfectly honest, that's what the research actually shows, right? We see a difference in when we still have to measure things by test scores, which sadly we still do. We do see an increase in test scores when students' social emotional needs in the classroom settings are being met, right? We don't always have control about what's happening outside of the classroom. Although I do think that was one of the other things that, when we went to virtual instruction and we had to connect more with families. It wasn't all bad, right? Like there were some really positive things that came out of that. And again, not to go back to the twatty, that's the way we've always done it. If you have an opportunity to make those connections with families before, we need to keep making those connections with families. Just because we're back in classrooms doesn't mean we shouldn't be connecting with those families.
I've never heard of the term twatty, by the way. So you're blowing my mind. So every time I chuckle because.
No, it's a great thing. That's the way we've always, yeah. And I can't, believe me, I didn't come up with that acronym. I only wish I had, but yeah, that's the way we've always done it. We've got to stop with in everything in the world, we've got to stop with, well, that's the way we've always done it. Yeah, no,
it's always, this is our heritage, this is our tradition, this is what we do every year, this is like those type of, but it doesn't make it right. And I think right now, when we just going back to the whole idea of social emotional learning being an issue, can we agree do we have to really get hung up on semantics these days? I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I have. Like, I think we can all agree that we have human beings in our classrooms that have various, backgrounds and experiences and language and culture, right? I think we can all agree on that. And that at the end of the day, we would like for them to be successful. When we look at research and what it takes for our students to be successful who have these differences and backgrounds and things like that, it says, you know what, kids do better when they can identify with the content, or the content is relevant to their needs or to their experiences. It makes sense to me. If I'm in a classroom and as a black male, I remember my days back as a student, right? And if I'm watching the content, I'm reading a book, and there's nothing that I can identify with, then we can talk about what does that engagement look like. I'm probably going to fall asleep, or I'm just not going to be as tuned in, as opposed to me watching or reading a book that has characters that have, again, similar experiences. But again, when we sit there and spend all of our time and look at various news channels and all this, parent uproars and all these things, but we're missing the point. And unfortunately, Beth, a lot of the pushback is coming from non-educators.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And which makes me think, I think the thing that I try to talk about in every single solitary presentation that I do, or if somebody says to me, well, what's the one thing that I can do in my classroom to make it more inclusive, to meet learners' social emotional needs, to make learners feel more engaged and empowered? Though the very first thing I tell them is make sure that the materials in your classroom reflect the learners in your classroom. And I can't remember, I recently saw the quote, but I honestly can't remember who it was from. I have it on my phone somewhere. But the idea around, I found the original quote from it, but the idea around providing mirrors and sliding doors, right?
Yeah.
That
when was it mirrors, windows, and sliding doors?
Exactly. Mirrors, windows, and sliding doors. That we've got to, learners need to see themselves, and that people have to realize, and I'll say this too, and I'll say this as a white woman, don't worry about the white children in your classroom seeing themselves in books or media or materials. They are. Don't worry. They are seeing themselves, but worry about some of the other children that might not be seeing themselves in that. And not just from a perspective of skin color, but also language, religion, we have to stop centering the dominant, what is perceived as the dominant culture, right? We've got to, thank you. Yeah, you've got that link up there. We've got to stop, centering that. And we've got to make sure, because that's what's going to sometimes be the hook, right? When a learner reads a book and they see themselves in it. And that's true for our kids with disabilities too. I am always looking for a book that is going to, that's going to have as a central character in it, a student with a disability, a student with, a student with a different language. And it's got to be a central character. There's a lot of things out there which has, thank you, Rudine Sims Bishop's Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Doors. Thank you, Megan. It's got to be not an ancillary or a secondary character, because there's a lot of that. There's always the best buddy who, is of color, or whatever it is. It's got to be those central characters. It's got to be the heroes, and the heroines, and the in book, and not just, it's not just color. It's also sexual identity. It's family dynamic, right? It's, those are all the things that learners need to see themselves, so that they can feel like, oh, there's a place for me here too. Can
I add to that? Do you mind?
Yeah, please.
So here's the thing. And I got to give a shout out to my good friend, Dr. LaWanda Wesley, who brought this to my attention, because sometimes we just say, we need to have diverse books and, diverse authors. And like you said, the characters need to, central characters need to be, represent various identities. But one of the things that Dr. Wesley was challenging me when we're thinking about that is, okay, but what do those family structures look like? What kind of occupations do the parents of that child, are they, in positions that don't require a college degree, or do we represent, attorneys or doctors and folks that might, require, like, positions that do require some form of college education, or are they living in apartments, or are they living in a large house? Like, what does that environment look like, in addition to having that representation of various identities? But also, what else comes along with that,
Yeah.
and I think that's a piece that I hadn't thought about, because my thing was, oh, let's just get more diverse books. But then I think we also had to consider, again, mirrors, windows, and glass, sliding glass. And I got to get Dr. Bishop on the show, by the way. So anybody who has a plug or got a connection, you can link me. I would love to have her on the show, because her work is referred to a lot on a lot of my episodes. But when we think about the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, we have students that are reading these books, that are reading these publications, watching these movies, watching these videos, and we want them to be able to see, there's a possibility that I could, be an entrepreneur, or that I could get into this field, or I can do this, or I can do that. And I think that needs to be included as well.
Absolutely. And then kind of the next thing, like when people, that's the first thing you can do, right? The next thing that when people say, well, what else can I do? It's the idea that use tools and resources that can be flexible too, right? Mm. So if I've got my paper book here. If the only thing, which, it's a wonderful paper book, but if the only way that I'm presenting text to a student is in a paper book format, and if the only opportunities for them to engage in responding is a paper and pencil, those are not very flexible options, right? And so when we have digital text, we provide students, we can make it larger for somebody who needs it to be bigger. We can use translation tools for someone whose first language might not be English and is going to be more successful if they can translate a sentence, a word, the whole thing. We can, when something's digital, it can be read out loud, right? For somebody who might do better hearing and listening to a book than simply reading it on its own. I remember my own daughter. So I have my daughter that's getting married. She had some learning challenges when she was growing up in high school, and was really having a hard time. She ADHD and learning disabilities, was really having a hard time with the higher level. She was an AP English, right? It wasn't a matter of skills, but she was having a really hard time managing with those texts. And I said, well, can't she just, can we get these as audiobooks for her? And the teacher was like, well, she has to read them. I'm like, all right, like I if you want to look at my Audible playlist, when I say people, like the books that I've listened to, I say I read those books, right? There's value in that. I can speak intelligently about the books that I have listened to, that I have ear read, right? So it's some of that same thing. Like, we've got to value when there's flexibility in how material is presented, in the tools that we're using, the materials that were presented. Then we are also empowering students to find the tools for learning that meet their needs. Now, my daughter did not have an IEP, right? Because she didn't qualify, right? She had the grade, she was a super hard worker, but she needed that flexibility. And so it's also the idea that these are not just tools. We don't just put certain tools in place with a kid that has an IEP, that there's certain tools that should be available. Like any kid, if I'm going to be more engaged in that text because I'm listening to an audio version of that text, than I am with reading it, and I'm going to be able to understand and digest and relate to that material, then why shouldn't any kid be able to do that? That's all part of that whole idea around inclusivity and universal design for learning. And it lends itself then to that culturally responsive teaching, that culturally responsive instruction as well. To be able to, you talked about having not only diverse books, but with diverse characters, but diverse authors. So the power of being able to listen to a book by a diverse author read out loud by a diverse voice actor, or even that author themselves, may be what is the hook that is needed for that student to be like, yeah, this means something to me.
When you mentioned about the UDL and having those options, I think you mentioned the menu. I always try to utilize it that way. It's like, okay, give them a menu of options, and that creates more buy-in. And I would have teachers that, working with IEPs, and they would get frustrated because, like, does this mean that I need to have 9 different lessons that I need to create for one, assessment? And I said, no, it's, UDL is not just for our students that have IEPs or have some accessibility or modifications are needed, but it's everyone can benefit from that. And I think when we've talked before on a former episode, you explained like the origins of UDL and the ramps and the architecture. Did you want to? Are you able to kind of share a little bit about that?
Right. So universal design for learning came out of the universal design and architecture movement. And so it's the idea that if I build a ramp and it's built into the architecture, then everybody can access it, right? It's built into the design. Like the Guggenheim Museum is a really good example of it. The High Museum in Chicago is another really good. It's built into the architecture of that. The way you travel from floor to floor within the building, it's not stairs, it's a ramp that is built into it. It's beautifully designed that way, as opposed to, we've all seen an older retrofitted building that has a ramp attached to it. Maybe it's in the back, and then you've got that individual who needs a ramp, is not able to, has got to go in the back door, right? Like, how demeaning is that? Like, yeah, you can go in, but you've got to go in through the back door. A lot of people have seen there's a cartoon out there that people in education may have seen, where it's got a set of stairs and then next to it is a ramp and it's snow covered, and the guy is like shoveling the stairs, and there's kids there, and one of them's in a wheelchair, and the kid in the wheelchair says, if you shoveled the ramp, we could all get in, right? Like, shoveling the stairs first. Like, if we shovel the ramp, we can all get in. So it's that idea of universal design. That's in architecture, right? And think about it. Like, we all use curb cuts, right? We use curb cuts so that we can get up with our skateboards, our bikes, our strollers, our rolling work bags, right? How great is it that, if you're walking and you're on your phone and you're about to step into an intersection and you feel the little bumpies underneath your feet, those are part of accommodations for individuals who are blind, but it's really helpful for those of us that got our eyes glued to our phone instead of looking at where our feet are going. And so it's the idea that these kinds of things are helpful to many, many people, not just one certain type of person, and that idea. And so it's that's where universal design comes from. It's the idea that there's a lot of resources that we can have, and it's also the idea of not just doing it after the fact, like not having someone come in and be like, oh, okay, now I need to think about this type of a learner. It's in the pre-planning. Like, how am I going to make my lessons as thank you for putting that up there. How am I going to make my lessons as accessible for everyone? And you had mentioned like the teacher that's so worried about, well, now I have to have 16 different rubrics. No. What you actually are going to have is like, look at what your goals, your standards are, right? Look at what your standards are. So if the standard is to be able to if the standard is to be able to use descriptive language and I was just doing some grammar work with a kid that I took, to be able to use similes and metaphors and coordinating conjunctions and all of that. Well, I can show my knowledge of that. Yeah, I can show my knowledge of that in a 3-paragraph essay, but I could also show it in a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to do. I could show it in a poem that I'm going to write. I could show it in a podcast that I'm going to record, because I'm going to, I have all these different ways that I could do it. I could even show it in artwork, that, right? If I'm talking about some of that descriptive language, I can even show it in the artwork that I'm going to do. That rubric is not about that you wrote 50 words in a 3-paragraph essay. That's not what you're checking off. It's that they showed an understanding of similes, that they showed an understanding. It doesn't matter the way that they did it. So you can grade that podcast, that art project, that that 3-paragraph essay, that bulleted slide deck that somebody put in. You can grade them all the same. I'm still going to be looking, to meet those standards. So it's really digging down. If you know the content you're teaching, you can just have one rubric for it. Rubrics are really helpful. They let learners know what's expected of them, but it doesn't have to be about, that you used 50 words and in this 3-paragraph essay style. There might be something you're looking for with that, but it's probably not, most of the time.
Unfortunately, that is how often, how a lot of us grade, including myself. I remember my days in the classroom, which wasn't that far away. It wasn't that long ago, but I was doing the same thing. Like, my rubric said, did this individual have, 3 paragraphs? Okay, check. Did this individual have certain words within their paragraphs, like keywords or definitions? And as opposed to saying, you know what, did they meet the content that I was looking for there, as opposed to it just being, it wasn't 10 pages. It was only 9.5. It was only 9 pages. And it's a little short. So I'm going to dock off some points. And that doesn't accurately reflect someone has grasped the concepts or any of those kind of things. You're just basically looking at the mechanics of the assignment, as opposed to actually looking at if the person has learned the assignment. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And it might be because of the students' need, because they need an accommodation or for a disability, but it might also be that you're going to hook that other student. That other student's going to be much more engaged if they can write a poem, or if they can, because that's what's meaningful to them, disability or no disability, right? There's more than one way to do things, right? There's more than one way. Yeah. Elizabeth, great comment on there, using choice boards, especially right. So you're giving them, these are some different ways. And so as an educator, you can think about that. That's part of that pre-planning. These are some different ways that you might be able to demonstrate what I need you to demonstrate. So I know whether you have mastered this learning objective or not. And what I would always try to put in there is like one other thing, and I do in graduate courses that I teach, right? Like I teach at the graduate level, and I always put in there, I'll put like 3 different options in. You can do this, you could do this, you could do this, but then I'll put a 4th one, or please come and talk to me about an option, and let's talk about, right? Like, come and talk to me because maybe you have another idea for
I love that. I love that. That is awesome. And I mean, say that one more, like, so you give, I want you to say that one more time, because
so I might give 3 different options, right? Like, so I teach a college course, and they can either give me one of the assignments that I will give is show me a design of a class. You need to create a design of a classroom that is going to meet the needs of a wide variety of learners, right? Classroom design is part of the course that I'm teaching. And so it could be, you could do a hand-drawn rendering. You could use some, you could go, there's a lot of software out there where you can, you can create your Bitmoji classroom. Like, so you could turn in your Bitmoji classroom. You could give me a written description of what everything is. Because, there are adult learners now that they're more comfortable with that. But then I'll always put the 4th, I haven't heard about Think Dots, but I'll always put as a 4th one, or come and talk to me if you have a different idea of how you can meet the learning objectives for this lesson. And we can decide, so if somebody had come up with, if somebody wanted to come up with something else, for all I know, they were going to, show me a Lego design of their classroom. I don't know, whatever is going to float their boat that's going to make them more engaged in it. And so now I want to know, Elizabeth, we're going to have to hear like about what is Think Dots. I have no idea what Think Dots are.
Drop a link in there, Elizabeth, if you can, on Think Dots. If you have some resource, drop a link in there, because I'm not familiar with it either. So if you can, that'll be awesome. And folks, as we're kind of wrapping up, we got a few more minutes left. I want to make sure that Beth has some opportunity to answer any questions that you may have as well. So if you have some questions, you can start popping them in. I'll show your comment on the screen there. Popsy says she loves the fourth option. Listen, I love the fourth option. That might actually go into my newsletter. So I think that is very important, and it's something that I haven't done. And sadly, the thing about doing this equity work, and I'll be the first one to admit, I don't know everything, and I'm learning just like everyone else. So thank you for that option. If you have any questions, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I think sometimes like when we're too open-ended and we say, show me however you want, people are like deer in the headlights. Like I can't think of anything. So giving like a few things, but then always having that opening, like you might have a better idea. And so it's part of that, and I also use the language like I invite you to give me another idea, right? Like I'm inviting you. It's not just, well, if you don't like any of these, come and talk to me. It's like I am inviting you, and I'll use that language like I invite you to come up with, and people come up with great ideas, right? But yet it's not so open-ended for them that they are like, okay, I'm just going to write that 3-paragraph essay because I don't know what else to do. Sometimes we need a little bit of examples. So Elizabeth said that the Think Dots is a choice board with 6 selections, each based on the different levels of knowledge. Okay. All right. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm going to have to do a little bit more research on that. Yeah. And Erin said student choice based on their own experiences and strengths. Exactly. Right. That's going to give them, again, when we talk about cognitive engagement, we don't get cognitive engagement unless learners believe that the learning and the work they're doing is relevant to them and to their lives and to their future.
Absolutely. And I by the way, I love the language. I invite you to come to me if you have another option. Because like you said, from a student's perspective, they may, I don't want to hurt the teacher's feelings. I don't want, maybe the last time I said something. So, but I love that you say, I invite you. That's really good language to utilize. If there's any questions, folks, go ahead and start popping those in. I dropped the link. I'm going to pull it up again here because I want folks to get their hands on the book as well. So you can definitely grab that. So if you look at the bottom of the screen there, there is a, Inclusive Learning 365 EdTech Strategies for Every Day of the Year. That's important. Grab that book as well. We want to support the work that Beth and her colleagues are doing. Beth, if we have some folks that want to connect with you, reach out, what are the best ways?
You can find me on Twitter at PossBeth, PossBeth. You can find me on Instagram. I finally figured out by the time I did Instagram that I could actually put my first name first and then my last name. So I'm on Instagram at Beth Poss, and you can always email me at PossBeth at gmail.com. So yeah, reach out to me. I love to connect with folks. Oh yes, the best lessons are the ones guided by the students themselves, without a doubt. And actually, like that's one of the strategies that we have in the book is that idea of that, whether it's, you want to call it like 10% time or 20% time, or where students are getting to pick something that they are really interested in doing, and not just what they're interested in doing, but the tools that they're interested in using to accomplish those tasks, and then reflecting back on it. Like, and the other thing is reflecting, like, did this work for me? Like, should I keep doing this, or should I try something different? Like, did this work for me? We need to have that reflection. Yeah, and And you're right, Aaron, I invite you supports that empowerment mindset. And it was actually, that was one of the, when we were writing the book, that was one of the terms that we did. So like in all the places that we would have said, like instead of like have students or have learners or ask learners, we instead used the terminology invite learners. We did that very, very purposely. And we carry that over in, I carry that over, and my co-authors carry that over in the work that we do as presenters to adult learners. So it's the kind of thing like we will put on a slide, like we invite you to respond in the chat, or we invite you to open this Jamboard. So it's not like you have to do it, but we invite you to, right? We it's not like go ahead and post that in the chat. We really try to be very purposeful with the language that we use. And I find it's really changed. Again, I think there's a connection to the language that we use and the way that we think. Because when I think about that language, it really makes me stop and think sometimes, like, is what I'm saying really what's I mean? Is that what's in my heart, or am I thinking about something else? You know, do I want to, is this conveying what I really mean, what's in my heart and what's in my head?
Absolutely. Whew, Beth, you brought the fire. You brought the fire. Thank you so much for your time. It's always, I always look forward to talking to you because every time you teach me so much, and again, UDL is very special to me, and just the inclusive learning. I'm very happy for the work that you're doing. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
You know, just that we all need to, you know, I think there's a lot out there on like growth mindset, right? And I think when we kind of move that into inclusive mindset, we can all change, right? We don't have to be twatty. We don't have to do it. We don't have to do things the way we've always done it. We can change, right? He's like laughing about the twatty, right?
Every time you say it, it's funny.
Right?
It's funny.
Right.
It's funny.
We can change, right? So just because you've done things one way doesn't mean that you have to keep doing them that way. It's also kind of the way that we develop the book. The book is intended, you don't have to sit, this is a thick, when we got on, you said, that's a thick book. It is, it's like a really thick book. There's 365 strategies. So it's more, each strategy is a page. So there's more, including the introduction, and the index, there's like 375 pages. There's more than that actually. But it's not the idea you got to read this whole thing. It's the idea like you could pick it up and read one page. It's one strategy. So it's that same idea of take a bite-sized chunk of something. You don't have to tackle everything and change everything right away. But if you are determined to eliminate twatty, just change one thing, and that's going to lead to another change, and it's going to lead to another change. And that's the way that we meet the needs of our learners these days.
Oh boy, this yeah, again, you brought the fire, folks. This is Beth Poss. Okay, y'all, if you're not following Beth Poss online, if you haven't grabbed the book, make sure that after this is done, that you grab the book and that you follow as well. She has lots of gems. She's been on the show as well. I don't have the link. I should have had that ready. But if you go on to the leadingequitycenter.com/podcast, you'll be able to find, I think you've been on the show at least once, maybe twice, right?
Yeah, I did a podcast with you, and I think I can't remember. I feel like there was one other thing that we did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Either way, you bring the fire each time, and I'm so happy. So again, Beth, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, guys. It was awesome to see all the amazing comments and everything. I always learn from the people that come and join us. So I'm gonna go. I've got Think Dots, and I've got some other things to check out too.
All right. So that was Beth Poss. Oh my gosh. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. Make sure, folks, we'll be back on next week. Next Thursday, I'll actually be in San Diego. So I'll probably be doing the show from the hotel room, but I will not miss next week. I plan to be here each week as we chat up the art of advocacy. I think that that's really important. Just a few takeaways from today's discussion. Probably the one that stood out the most for me was the idea of changing some of the way that we talk to our students, such as simple as just saying I invite you to offer feedback maybe, or I invite you to, if you have an alternative way that you would like to present this content to me, I invite you to have that conversation with me. And I think that really opens up an opportunity for students. And I think it was Aaron that mentioned, that is an empowerment mindset. And I think that that's really important. This has truly been a great episode. I am very excited for next week as well. So if you haven't subscribed already to the channel, make sure you subscribe to Leading Equity Center's channel. Either you can follow us on Facebook, you can follow us on YouTube as well, and share. Please share as well. I think that's important. Remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice in leading equity.